I never thought my life would unravel over a plate of chicken parmesan. But that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday evening in March, when my husband of 12 years decided that violence was an appropriate response to burnt garlic bread. My name is Rebecca Torres, and I'm 41 years old. For the past decade, I've been teaching third grade at Lincoln Elementary, pouring my heart into shaping young minds, while my own life slowly suffocated under the weight of a marriage that had turned toxic, without me fully realizing it. Daniel, my husband, worked in corporate finance, the kind of job that came with a decent salary, but demanded 70-hour weeks, and left him perpetually stressed, perpetually angry, perpetually looking for someone to blame. We met when I was 29, at a friend's wedding. I was standing by the bar, nursing a glass of wine, when he approached me with a confidence that I found attractive at the time. He was charming, funny, successful. He told me about his job, his ambitions, his 5-year plan. I told him about my love for teaching, about the kids I worked with, about how rewarding it was to watch a child finally understand something they'd been struggling with. He seemed interested, genuinely interested, and we talked for hours. Our courtship was intense. He pursued me with flowers, expensive dinners, weekend getaways. He made me feel special, chosen, like I was the most important person in his world. Looking back now, I can see the red flags I missed. The way he subtly criticized my clothes, suggesting different styles would suit me better. The way he got irritated when I made plans with friends, saying he'd hoped we could spend that time together. The way he made decisions for both of us without consulting me, then acted hurt when I questioned him. But I was in love, or what I thought was love, and I explained away his behavior. He was just trying to help me look my best. He just wanted to spend time with me. He was just being thoughtful by making plans. I told myself these things, convinced myself that his controlling behaviors were actually signs of how much he cared. We got engaged after 8 months of dating. My mother had concerns, said we were moving too fast, that I should take more time to really get to know him. Jennifer was more direct, telling me she didn't like how he talked to me sometimes, how he seemed to diminish my accomplishments while constantly highlighting his own. But I dismissed their worries. They didn't understand our relationship. They didn't see how good things were when we were alone together. The wedding was beautiful. Exactly what I'd dreamed of. Daniel looked handsome in his tuxedo, and as I walked down the aisle toward him, I felt certain I was making the right choice. We honeymooned in Italy, 2 weeks of exploring ancient cities and eating incredible food. It should have been perfect, but even then, there were moments that troubled me. He got angry when I wanted to visit a museum instead of the restaurant he'd picked. He made a scene when our hotel room wasn't exactly what he'd requested. He snapped at me when I accidentally left our tour group behind because I'd stopped to take photos. Each time he apologized afterward, blamed his behavior on stress or jet lag or the heat. And each time, I forgave him. Told myself that everyone has bad moments, that marriage was about accepting imperfections. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. We were learning to live together, to navigate each other's habits and expectations. Daniel was particular about how the house should be kept. He wanted dinner at a specific time. He expected me to manage all the household tasks because his job was more demanding than mine. I tried to accommodate his preferences, tried to be understanding about the pressure he was under at work. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started shrinking. I stopped suggesting activities I wanted to do because he usually dismissed them. I stopped sharing good things that happened at work because he'd minimize them or change the subject to talk about his own day. I stopped wearing certain clothes because he'd made comments about them. I was becoming smaller, quieter, less myself, and I didn't even realize it was happening. By year 3, the verbal criticism had become constant. I couldn't do anything right in his eyes. The house was never clean enough. Dinner was never good enough. I spent too much money, or I was too cheap. I paid too much attention to my students, or I wasn't dedicated enough to my career. The criticisms contradicted each other, but they all had the same effect, making me feel inadequate, making me question myself, making me believe that I was the problem. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to figure out why I couldn't seem to make my husband happy. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, started asking questions that made me uncomfortable. She asked about how Daniel spoke to me, how he treated me, whether I felt respected in my marriage. I defended him, explained that he was just stressed, that his job was demanding, that he didn't mean the harsh things he said. Dr. Martinez said, "Rebecca, Stress is not an excuse for cruelty. Everyone experiences stress, but not everyone responds by tearing down the people they love. I stopped going to therapy after that session. Her words were too confronting, too challenging to my carefully constructed narrative that my marriage was fine, that I just needed to try harder, be better, do more. By year 5, I'd stopped talking to my friends about my marriage. I couldn't bear the concerned looks, the gentle questions about whether everything was okay. I isolated myself, convinced that no one would understand, that they'd judge me for staying, that admitting the truth would mean admitting I'd made a terrible mistake. The years blurred together after that. I threw myself into my work, finding validation and purpose in my classroom that I couldn't find at home. My students became my lifeline, their progress and growth the only things that made me feel competent and valued. I'd stay late at school, grading papers and preparing lessons, delaying the moment when I'd have to go home and face Daniel's criticism and contempt. There were good days occasionally. Days when Daniel was in a good mood, when he'd laugh at something I said or compliment a meal I'd made. Those days gave me hope, made me think that maybe things could get better, that maybe the man I'd married was still in there somewhere. But those days became rarer and rarer, brief interludes in an otherwise relentless pattern of emotional abuse. I learned to read his moods, to predict what would set him off, to navigate around his anger like walking through a minefield. I became an expert at placating, at soothing, at making myself invisible when necessary. It was exhausting, living in a constant state of vigilance, never knowing which version of Daniel I'd encounter when he walked through the door. That morning started like any other. I woke up at 5:30, went for my usual jog through our suburban neighborhood, came home to shower, and prepared breakfast while Daniel got ready for work. We barely spoke, which had become our normal. He grunted a goodbye, I mumbled something about dinner at 7, and he was gone. I spent the day with my students, helping little Emma with her multiplication tables, mediating a playground dispute between two boys fighting over a basketball, grading spelling tests during my lunch break. When I got home at 4, I was exhausted, but determined to make a nice dinner. It was our anniversary next week, 12 years of marriage, and I kept telling myself that things would get better, that we just needed to reconnect, that the man I'd fallen in love with at 29 was still in there somewhere beneath all that anger and resentment. I decided on chicken parmesan, his favorite. I spent 2 hours in the kitchen, carefully breading the chicken, making the marinara sauce from scratch using my grandmother's recipe, preparing a Caesar salad, and baking garlic bread. The kitchen smelled amazing, like an Italian restaurant, and for a moment I felt hopeful. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe we'd actually talk, really talk, about what was happening to us. Daniel came home at 7:15, already irritated about traffic. He barely acknowledged me, just loosened his tie and headed straight for the living room, where he turned on the television and started scrolling through his phone. I called him to dinner at 7:30. He sat down without a word, looked at the plate I'd set in front of him, and immediately his face darkened. Daniel said, "The bread is burnt." I looked at the garlic bread. Yes, the edges were darker than I'd intended, slightly crispy, but not ruined, just a little overdone. I responded, "It's a bit dark, but it's still good. I can make more if you want." He didn't respond. He just stared at the bread with this expression of pure disgust, as if I'd served him garbage. Then he picked up a piece and slammed it back down on the plate. Daniel said, "I work 12 hours a day, and I come home to burnt food. Is that really so much to ask? A decent meal?" Something twisted in my stomach. His tone wasn't just annoyed. It was contemptuous, dripping with disdain. I said, "Daniel, I spent 2 hours making this dinner. The bread is slightly overdone. Everything else is perfect. Can we please just eat and have a nice evening?" He laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was cold and mocking. Daniel said, "A nice evening? With you? When was the last time we had a nice evening, Rebecca? You're always tired, always distracted with your little kids and your little job, always making excuses for why you can't be a proper wife." The words hit me like physical blows. I'd heard variations of this speech before, but never with quite this level of venom. My hands started shaking. I put down my fork. I said, "That's not fair. I work hard too. I'm trying here. I made your favorite dinner." Daniel said, "You made garbage." He pushed his plate away so hard it slid across the table and crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. chicken, sauce, and broken ceramic scattered across our dining room floor. I stared at the mess, my heart pounding, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I said, "Daniel, what is wrong with you?" He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His face was red, his jaw clenched. Daniel said, "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you? You're a disappointment, Rebecca. A complete disappointment." I stood up too, my whole body trembling now. Years of swallowing his criticisms, his put-downs, his constant complaints suddenly felt like too much. Something inside me cracked. I said, "I'm a disappointment? I've given you everything. I've supported your career. I've managed this entire house. I've made excuse after excuse for your behavior. When did you become this person? When did you become someone who treats me like this?" His eyes narrowed, and I saw something dangerous flash across his face. He walked around the table toward me, and I instinctively took a step back. Daniel said, "Don't you dare talk to me like that. Don't you dare." I said, "Or what? What are you going to do?" That's when it happened. His hand came up fast, and before I could react, he slapped me across the face. The sound echoed through the dining room. My cheek exploded in pain, and I stumbled backward, catching myself on the wall. For several seconds, I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what had just occurred. I touched my face. It was burning, throbbing. I looked at Daniel, and he was staring at his own hand like he couldn't believe what he'd done. But he didn't apologize. He didn't move toward me. He just stood there, breathing hard, his expression shifting from shock to something else. Justification, maybe. Or defiance. Daniel said, "You pushed me to it. You always push me." Those words cut deeper than the slap itself. He was blaming me. For his violence, for his inability to control himself. For everything. I said, "Get out." My voice came out stronger than I expected, clear and cold. Daniel said, "What?" I said, "Get out of this house, right now." He laughed again, that awful dismissive laugh. Daniel said, "This is my house, I'm not going anywhere. You want to leave? Go ahead." But I didn't leave. I walked past him, went upstairs to our bedroom, and locked the door. I sat on the bed, my face still throbbing, my mind racing. I could hear him downstairs, the television turning on, the sound of a beer being opened as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening over and over. The slap itself was horrifying, but what terrified me more was the realization that this had been building for years. The verbal abuse, the constant criticism, the way he made me feel small and worthless. The slap was just the physical manifestation of something that had been happening all along. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I couldn't stay in this marriage. I wouldn't. But I also knew that leaving wouldn't be simple. We owned the house together. Our finances were intertwined. And Daniel wasn't the type to just accept defeat. He'd fight me, make things difficult, maybe even try to paint me as the problem. At 6 a.m, I heard him get up, shower, and get ready for work. He knocked on the bedroom door. Daniel said, "Rebecca, open the door. We need to talk." I didn't respond. After a minute, he left. I heard the front door close, his car start, and then silence. I got up, looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My cheek was bruised, a faint purple mark where his hand had made contact. Evidence. I grabbed my phone and took several photos. Then I got dressed, went downstairs, and surveyed the damage from the night before. The broken plate was still on the floor. I left it there and took photos of that too. Documentation. I was a teacher, I was organized, I was methodical. If Daniel wanted a fight, I'd be prepared. I called in sick to work, then I called my best friend, Maria. We'd known each other since college, and she'd always been straight with me, even when I didn't want to hear it. She answered on the second ring. Maria said, "Hey, what's up?" I said, "Maria, I need help. Daniel hit me last night." There was a long pause. Maria said, "He what?" I told her everything. The dinner, the argument, the slap. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Maria said, "I'm coming over. Right now. Don't do anything until I get there." She arrived 30 minutes later, When she saw my face, her expression hardened. Maria said, "We're going to the police, right now." I said, "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Maria said, "Rebecca, listen to me. He hit you. That's assault. You need to file a report. You need to start creating a paper trail. If you're going to leave him, you need to protect yourself." She was right. I knew she was right. We drove to the police station and I filed a report. The officer who took my statement was professional but clearly had seen this situation countless times before. He took photos of my bruise, documented my account of what happened, and gave me information about restraining orders and domestic violence resources. When we got back to my house, Maria made me tea while I sat at the kitchen table, feeling numb. Maria said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to leave him. I'm done. I've been done for a while, I just didn't want to admit it." Maria said, "Then let's make a plan. Do you have somewhere you can stay?" I nodded. My sister Jennifer lived about an hour away. She'd been telling me for years that my marriage was unhealthy, that Daniel was controlling and mean. I'd always defended him, made excuses. Now I'd have to admit she'd been right all along. Maria said, "Call her. Tell her what happened. And then we need to get you a lawyer. A good one." Over the next few hours, Maria helped me start putting together an exit strategy. I called Jennifer, who immediately offered me her guest room for as long as I needed. I called a divorce attorney that Maria recommended, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had a reputation for being tough and thorough. I scheduled an appointment for the following day. Then Maria said something that surprised me. Maria said, "You know what you should do? Pack his stuff. Put it all in suitcases and set them by the door. Make it clear he's not welcome here anymore." I said, "This is his house too. Legally, I can't just kick him out." Maria said, "Maybe not legally, but you can make a statement. You can show him you're serious. And honestly, after what he did, he deserves to come home to his bags packed." The idea appealed to me. There was something symbolic about it, something empowering. For years, I'd been passive in this marriage, accepting his behavior, trying to keep the peace. Packing his bags would be an action, a declaration. I said, "Okay, let's do it." Maria and I spent the afternoon going through the house. I pulled his clothes from our closet, his toiletries from the bathroom, his shoes from the rack by the door. I filled 3 large suitcases with his belongings. Maria suggested I include some of his personal items too, things that would make it clear this wasn't temporary. I packed his laptop, his favorite books, his golf clubs, even the framed photo of his parents that sat on his nightstand. As I was packing, I kept thinking about the 12 years we'd spent together. There had been good times, early on. He'd been charming when we first met, funny and attentive. But looking back now with clear eyes, I could see that even then there had been warning signs. The way he'd criticized my clothes, suggesting I'd look better in different styles. The way he'd discouraged me from spending time with my friends, claiming he wanted more alone time with me. The way he'd subtly put down my career, implying that teaching was less important than his job in finance. I'd ignored all of it, explained it away, because I wanted the relationship to work. Because I'd been taught that marriage required compromise and sacrifice. But there's a difference between compromise and erasure, between sacrifice and self-destruction. By 5 in the evening, I had 3 packed suitcases sitting in the entryway. Maria looked at them and then looked at me. Maria said, "Are you sure you want to be here when he gets home? You could come stay with me tonight." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to avoid the confrontation entirely. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger all day, wanted to face him. Wanted him to see that I wasn't afraid anymore. I said, "I'll be okay. You should go home. You've done so much for me today." Maria said, "Call me if anything happens. Anything at all. I'll be here in 20 minutes. She hugged me tightly before she left, and I stood in the quiet house, waiting. Daniel usually got home around 7. I had 2 hours. I spent that time cleaning up the mess from last night's dinner. I swept up the broken plate, wiped down the table, put away the leftover food. As I worked, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. This morning I'd been terrified, hurt, confused. Now I felt clear, determined. I was taking control of my life, maybe for the first time in years. At 7:15, I heard his car in the driveway. My heart started pounding, but I stood my ground. The front door opened, and Daniel walked in. He stopped when he saw the suitcases. Daniel said, "What is this?" I was standing in the living room doorway. I'd positioned myself where I could see him but maintain distance. I said, "Your things. I've packed your things. You need to leave." He stared at the suitcases, then at me. His face cycled through several emotions: confusion, anger, and then something that might have been fear. Daniel said, "You can't kick me out of my own house." I said, "I filed a police report today for assault. There are photos of my bruise, documentation of what you did. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll get a restraining order. I've already spoken to a lawyer." His face went pale. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel looked genuinely rattled. Daniel said, "Rebecca, let's talk about this. I'm sorry about last night. I was stressed, I overreacted, but we can work this out." I said, "No, we can't. This isn't just about last night. This is about years of you treating me like I'm worthless. Years of verbal abuse, manipulation, control. Last night you just made it physical. But the truth is, you've been hurting me for a long time." Daniel said, "That's not fair. I've provided for you, given you a good life, a nice house." I said, "You've given me money and material things, but you've taken away my self-respect, my confidence, my happiness. That's not a good life, Daniel. That's a prison." He took a step toward me, and I immediately raised my hand. I said, "Don't. Don't come any closer. Take your bags and leave. We'll communicate through lawyers from now on." Daniel said, "You're going to regret this. You think you can make it on your own, on a teacher's salary? You need me." I said, "I really don't. And that's what scares you, isn't it? That I'll be fine without you. Better than fine." He stood there for a long moment, and I could see him trying to decide his next move. Finally, he grabbed one of the suitcases with more force than necessary. Daniel said, "Fine. But this isn't over. I'll fight you on everything. The house, the money, all of it." I said, "Do what you need to do, but you're not staying here tonight. Or any other night." He grabbed the other 2 suitcases and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back to me. Daniel said, "You'll come crawling back. You always do." I said, "Not this time." He left, slamming the door behind him. I stood there for a few minutes, listening to his car start and drive away. Then my knees gave out, and I sank to the floor, shaking. It was done. He was gone. I'd actually done it. I called Maria and told her what happened. Then I called Jennifer. Both of them were proud of me, supportive, ready to help however they could. That night, I slept in my own bed, in my own house, for the first time in 12 years, without the weight of Daniel's presence suffocating me. The sheets felt lighter. The air felt cleaner. Even though I knew hard times were ahead, legal battles and financial stress and all the complications of divorce, in that moment, I felt free. The next morning, I woke up and went for a run. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. My cheek still hurt, but the bruise was already starting to fade. As I ran, I thought about all the ways I'd let myself shrink over the years, all the dreams I'd set aside, all the parts of myself I'd buried to make room for Daniel's ego and demands. When I got home, I found an envelope on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a note from Daniel. The note read, "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed our marriage over one mistake. But fine. You want a divorce? You'll get one. And I'll make sure you regret it." I read the note once, then tore it into pieces and threw it away. His words had no power over me anymore. Over the next few weeks, I met with my lawyer several times. Patricia was exactly what I needed, fierce and strategic. She explained the divorce process, what to expect, how to protect myself financially. We filed the paperwork, and Daniel was served. As promised, he fought me on everything. He wanted the house. He wanted me to pay him spousal support, claiming I'd been the one who destroyed the marriage. He hired an expensive attorney and prepared for battle, but I had something he didn't expect. I had documentation, the police report with photos of my bruise, text messages from over the years where he'd berated me, called me names, threatened to leave me if I didn't do what he wanted. testimony from Maria and Jennifer about the things they'd witnessed, statements from neighbors who'd heard us arguing, heard him yelling at me. The legal process was exhausting. There were court dates, mediation sessions, endless paperwork. Daniel tried everything to intimidate me. He showed up at my school once, standing in the parking lot, staring at me until I called security. He sent me angry texts at all hours. He told mutual friends that I was crazy, that I'd made everything up, that he was the victim. The first mediation session was particularly brutal. We sat across from each other at a conference table, lawyers on either side, a mediator at the head. Daniel's lawyer was aggressive, painting me as vindictive and unreasonable. They tried to argue that I was exaggerating the abuse, that the slap was an isolated incident, that Daniel was the real victim of my emotional manipulation. I sat there, listening to them twist the narrative, and I felt the old fear creeping back. The fear that maybe they were right, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I should just give up and give Daniel what he wanted. But then I looked down at my hands, at the folder containing all my documentation, the police report, the photos of my bruise, the text messages, and I remembered who I was now. I wasn't the woman who'd accept blame for someone else's violence. Not anymore. My lawyer, Patricia, was fierce. She presented evidence methodically, calmly, never rising to the bait when Daniel's lawyer got aggressive. She showed the police report, the photos, the pattern of abusive text messages. She had statements from Maria and Jennifer, from neighbors who'd heard arguments, from my therapist who I'd started seeing again after leaving Daniel. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly at the mediator and told my story. I talked about the years of verbal abuse, the constant criticism, the way Daniel had systematically broken down my self-esteem. I talked about that night, about the slap, about the look in his eyes when he blamed me for his violence. My voice didn't shake, my hands didn't tremble. I was strong, clear, certain. Daniel tried to interrupt several times, but the mediator shut him down. When I finished, there was silence in the room. Even Daniel's lawyer looked uncomfortable. The mediation didn't result in an agreement. Daniel refused to be reasonable about the division of assets. He wanted everything, the house, the savings, even items that were clearly mine. His lawyer filed motions, trying to delay the process, trying to wear me down. But I didn't break. Every time I felt weak, I'd call Maria or Jennifer or my lawyer, and they'd remind me why I was doing this, what I was fighting for. The discovery phase was invasive. We had to disclose all our financial information, all our assets, everything. Daniel tried to hide money, opening accounts I didn't know about, transferring funds to his brother. But Patricia was thorough. She hired a forensic accountant who found everything, documented every attempt Daniel made to cheat me. As the case progressed, I started hearing from other people, women who'd dated Daniel before me, friends of friends who'd witnessed his behavior. One woman, Sarah, reached out through Facebook. She'd dated Daniel briefly before he met me. She told me about her experience with him, how charming he'd been at first, how quickly he'd turned controlling and mean. She said she'd broken up with him after 6 months, but that he'd harassed her for years afterward, sending angry messages, spreading rumors about her, trying to sabotage her relationships. Sarah said, "When I heard you'd married him, I wanted to warn you. But I figured he'd changed, that maybe he'd grown up. I'm so sorry you had to go through this." I thanked her for reaching out, for validating my experience. Hearing her story made me realize that Daniel's behavior wasn't about me, wasn't caused by anything I'd done wrong. This was who he was, a pattern he'd repeated with multiple women. I'd just been unlucky enough to marry him. The court proceedings took months. We had hearings about temporary support, about who would stay in the house during the divorce, about every tiny detail of our shared life. Each hearing was stressful, each one requiring me to take time off work, to sit in a courtroom and listen to Daniel's lawyer paint me as the villain in our story. But slowly things started shifting in my favor. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd seen countless domestic violence cases, clearly didn't buy Daniel's narrative. During one hearing, when Daniel's lawyer suggested that the slap was my fault because I'd provoked him, the judge actually interrupted. The judge said, "Counselor, I'd advise you to change your approach. There is no provocation that justifies physical violence. Continue down this path and you won't be helping your client." Daniel's face went red with anger, but he couldn't say anything. That moment felt like a victory, a validation that what had happened to me was wrong, that I wasn't crazy or vindictive for refusing to accept it. But I didn't back down. Every time I felt weak or scared, I'd remember that night. The sound of his hand hitting my face, the contempt in his voice when he blamed me for his violence. And I'd remember the feeling of standing up to him, of packing his bags, of reclaiming my space and my dignity. My students became my lifeline. Every day, I'd go to school and immerse myself in teaching. Emma finally mastered her multiplication tables. Two boys who'd been fighting became best friends. A quiet girl named Sophie started raising her hand in class after I'd encouraged her for weeks. These small victories reminded me why I loved teaching, why my job mattered, even if Daniel had always dismissed it. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult mediation session where Daniel had accused me of being selfish and cruel, I came home feeling defeated. I sat in my car in the driveway, too exhausted to even go inside. My phone rang. It was my mother. My mother said, "Jennifer told me what's been happening. Why didn't you call me sooner?" I said, "I guess I was ashamed. I felt like I'd failed." My mother said, "Failed at what? Escaping an abusive marriage? That's not failure, honey. That's courage." I started crying, something I'd been holding back for weeks. My mother said, "Listen to me. Your father and I have been married for 43 years. It hasn't always been perfect, but I'll tell you what it's never been. It's never been violent. It's never been cruel. Real love doesn't tear you down. It builds you up. That man didn't deserve you." Those words meant more to me than she could know. I'd spent so long blaming myself, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed to keep my marriage together. Hearing my mother validate my choice to leave, to fight back, to refuse to accept abuse, helped me forgive myself. The divorce took 6 months to finalize. In the end, we split our assets roughly down the middle. I kept the house, but I had to buy out his share, which meant taking on a significant mortgage. It would be tight financially, but I'd manage. Daniel got most of our savings and investments. Neither of us got spousal support. The judge, after reviewing all the evidence, including the police report and my documentation of Daniel's behavior, made it clear that he wasn't going to reward Daniel's conduct. When the final papers were signed, I felt a mixture of relief and grief. Relief that it was over, that I was free. Grief for the 12 years I'd lost. For the person I'd been when we got married, young and hopeful and full of dreams that had slowly been crushed under the weight of Daniel's narcissism and cruelty. But I also felt something else. I felt strong. I'd faced my worst fear, stood up to someone who'd controlled and diminished me for years, and I'd won. Not because I got more money or kept the house, but because I'd reclaimed myself. After the divorce, I made some changes. I went back to therapy, something I'd stopped years ago because Daniel had mocked it. Dr. Martinez welcomed me back with warmth and no judgment. We worked through the trauma of the marriage, the patterns of thinking that had kept me trapped, the ways I'd learned to diminish myself to keep the peace. Dr. Martinez said, "You spent 12 years learning to be small. Now we're going to help you remember how to be big again." It was hard work. I had to confront painful truths about myself, about why I'd stayed so long, about the ways I'd been complicit in my own suffering by not setting boundaries, by accepting unacceptable behavior. But I also had to learn self-compassion, to understand that staying in an abusive relationship didn't make me weak or stupid. It made me human. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, college roommates I hadn't spoken to in years, colleagues from my first teaching job who'd drifted away when I'd stopped returning their calls. Many of them had noticed something was wrong, had tried to reach out, but I'd pushed them away, too ashamed to admit what my life had become. My friend Laura from college invited me to her book club. I hadn't read anything for pleasure in years, too exhausted from managing Daniel's moods to have energy for hobbies. But I said yes, and that first meeting, sitting in Laura's living room with 6 other women, discussing a novel and drinking wine and laughing, I felt a piece of myself coming back to life. I took a painting class at the community center, rediscovering a hobby I'd loved in college but had abandoned. The first time I picked up a brush, I felt nervous, uncertain. What if I wasn't good at it anymore? What if I'd lost whatever talent I'd once had? But the instructor, an older woman named Ruth, was encouraging. Ruth said, "Art isn't about being good or bad. It's about expressing yourself, about putting your inner world onto canvas. Just let yourself play. I painted abstract pieces at first, swirls of color that didn't represent anything specific, but somehow captured how I was feeling. Chaotic, turbulent, but with hints of brightness breaking through. As the weeks progressed, my paintings became lighter, more hopeful. Ruth noticed. Ruth said, "Your work is changing. It's like watching someone come out of darkness into light." She was right. I was emerging from darkness, slowly but surely, rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I started saying yes to things that made me happy, and no to things that didn't. It sounds simple, but for someone who'd spent over a decade prioritizing someone else's happiness over her own, it was revolutionary. When a colleague asked me to cover her class during my planning period, I considered whether I had the energy and capacity. If the answer was no, I said no. No explanation, no apology, just a simple declination. When Jennifer invited me to join her for a yoga retreat weekend, my first instinct was to decline, to say I was too busy or too tired. But then I asked myself, do I want to do this? The answer was yes. So I went, and it was wonderful. 2 days of meditation, yoga, healthy food, and deep conversations with my sister. We talked about our childhood, about our parents' marriage, about what we wanted for our futures. Jennifer said, "I'm so proud of you, you know. What you did, leaving Daniel, rebuilding everything. That took real courage." I said, "I don't feel courageous. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding it together." Jennifer said, "That's what courage is, not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. You're one of the strongest people I know." Her words meant everything to me. For so long, I'd felt weak, broken, inadequate. Hearing someone I loved and respected call me strong helped me start believing it myself. I also made changes in my professional life. I started speaking up more in faculty meetings, sharing ideas I'd previously kept to myself for fear they weren't good enough. I volunteered to lead professional development sessions for other teachers. I applied for grants to fund special projects in my classroom. My principal noticed the change. She called me into her office one day, and I felt that old fear, the assumption that I'd done something wrong. But she was smiling. The principal said, "Rebecca, I wanted to tell you that I've been really impressed with your contributions this year. The reading program you developed has been incredibly successful, and several teachers have asked if you'd be willing to mentor them. Have you ever considered moving into an instructional leadership role?" I said, "I haven't actually, but I'd be interested in learning more." That conversation planted a seed. Maybe I didn't have to stay in the same position forever. Maybe I could grow, advance, take on new challenges. Daniel had always dismissed my career, implied that teaching was a cute hobby rather than a real profession. But it was real. It was important, and I was good at it. As I rebuilt my life, I also rebuilt my relationship with my parents. During my marriage to Daniel, I distanced myself from them, partly because their happy marriage made me too aware of how unhappy mine was, partly because Daniel always had criticisms after we spent time with them. My mother talked too much. My father was boring. They asked too many questions. It was easier to limit contact than to deal with Daniel's complaints. Now, freed from his influence, I started calling them regularly. I drove down to visit them every few weeks. We'd have dinner, play cards, talk about everything and nothing. They never said they'd told me so about Daniel. They just welcomed me back into their lives with open arms and unconditional love. My father said during one visit, "You know, your mother and I, we knew something wasn't right with your marriage, but we didn't know how to help without pushing you away." My mother said, "All we could do was love you and hope that when you were ready, you'd know we were here." I said, "I'm sorry I shut you out." My father said, "Don't apologize. We're just glad you found your way back to yourself." One Saturday afternoon, about 8 months after Daniel left, I was at a coffee shop grading papers when a man approached my table. The man said, "Excuse me, is anyone sitting here?" I looked up. He was tall, maybe my age, with kind eyes and a warm smile. The coffee shop was crowded, and the only open seat was at my table. I said, "No, please, sit down." He sat, and we fell into easy conversation. His name was Marcus. He was a social worker, passionate about helping families navigate difficult situations. We talked for 2 hours, and it was the most natural, comfortable conversation I'd had with a man in years. There was no pressure, no judgment, just two people sharing stories and laughing. When we parted, he asked for my number. I hesitated, not sure if I was ready. But then I thought about everything I'd been through, how far I'd come, and I realized I didn't have to be ready for anything. I could just see where things went, without expectations or fear. I said, sure. Marcus and I started dating slowly. He was patient with my hesitations, understanding when I talked about my marriage and divorce. He never pushed, never demanded, never made me feel like I owed him anything. He was simply present, supportive, kind. It was such a stark contrast to Daniel that sometimes I had to remind myself this was real, that healthy relationships actually existed. One evening, about 4 months into dating, Marcus and I were having dinner at a small Italian restaurant. He'd just finished telling a funny story about a client's mischievous 5-year-old when he reached across the table and took my hand. Marcus said, "Can I tell you something?" I said, "Of course." Marcus said, "I know you've been through a lot. I know trust doesn't come easy for you, and I understand that. But I want you to know that I see you. Not what you can do for me, not what you can provide, just you. And I think you're incredible. Your strength, your compassion, the way you care about your students, the way you rebuilt your life. That's not common. That's special." My eyes filled with tears. For so long I'd been told I was inadequate, disappointing, not enough. Hearing Marcus say these things, seeing the genuine affection in his eyes, it healed something in me I didn't even realize was still broken. I said, "Thank you. That means more than you know." He squeezed my hand. Marcus said, "I'm not in a rush. Whatever pace you need, whatever boundaries you need, I'm here." That night, driving home, I thought about the journey I'd been on. From that terrible night when Daniel slapped me, to packing his bags, to fighting through a brutal divorce, to slowly rebuilding my life and learning to trust again. It hadn't been easy. There had been days when I wanted to give up, when the loneliness felt crushing, when I questioned whether I'd made the right choice. But sitting in that restaurant with Marcus, feeling seen and valued and respected, I knew I'd made the right choice. Not just in leaving Daniel, but in choosing myself. In refusing to accept a life that made me small and sad and scared. A year after my divorce was finalized, my school hosted a career day. We invited various professionals to come speak to the students about their jobs. Marcus volunteered to talk about social work. Watching him interact with my students, seeing how patient and encouraging he was, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a decade. Hope. Real, genuine hope for the future. After the presentations, Marcus found me in my classroom. The students had just left for recess, and I was straightening up. Marcus said, "Your kids are amazing. You've done such a great job with them." I said, "They're the reason I kept going, you know. During the divorce, when everything felt impossible, coming here every day and teaching them, seeing their growth, it reminded me what matters." Marcus said, "You're an incredible teacher, and an incredible person." He kissed me, gentle and sweet, and I kissed him back, feeling grateful and lucky and completely myself. That night, I had dinner with Jennifer and Maria. We met at our favorite restaurant, a Mexican place where we'd been going for years. As we ate chips and salsa, they asked about Marcus, about work, about life in general. And I realized, sitting there with my sister and best friend, eating good food and laughing, that I was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way I hadn't been in years. Maria said, "I'm so proud of you, you know. What you did, standing up to Daniel, rebuilding everything. That took real courage." Jennifer said, "Remember when I used to tell you he was no good, and you'd defend him?" I said, "I remember. I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner." Jennifer said, "Don't be sorry. You got there when you were ready. That's what matters." Maria said, "So, are you glad you packed his bags, with the dramatic exit and everything?" I laughed. It seems so long ago now. That afternoon spent packing Daniel's belongings, the confrontation when he came home, the way I'd stood my ground despite being terrified. I said, "Yeah, I'm glad." It was symbolic, you know. For so long I'd been passive, letting things happen to me. Packing his bags was the first time I took action, made a choice about my own life. It was scary, but it was also liberating. Jennifer said, "Whatever happened to him, do you know?" I said, "Last I heard, he moved to Chicago for work. I don't keep tabs on him. That chapter is closed." And it was. Daniel was part of my past, a painful lesson learned, but no longer someone who had any power over my present or future. As we finished dinner, Maria raised her margarita glass. Maria said, "To Rebecca, for being brave enough to leave, strong enough to rebuild, and wise enough to recognize what she deserves." We clinked glasses, and I felt a rush of emotion. Gratitude for these women who'd supported me through the darkest time of my life. Pride in how far I'd come. Excitement for what lay ahead. Over the next year, my relationship with Marcus deepened. We talked about everything, our pasts, our dreams, our fears. He introduced me to his family, and they welcomed me warmly. I introduced him to my students on field day, and they loved him, especially when he volunteered to help with the relay races. One Sunday morning, Marcus and I were having brunch at my house. I'd made pancakes, and we were sitting on my back patio, enjoying the warm spring weather. Marcus said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Always." Marcus said, "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Daniel, going through all that pain?" I thought about the question seriously. Did I regret it? Regret leaving an abusive marriage? Regret fighting for my freedom? Regret choosing myself? I said, "No, not even for a second." I regret staying as long as I did. I regret not seeing the signs earlier, not valuing myself enough to leave sooner. But leaving him? Standing up to him? That was the best decision I ever made. It gave me my life back. Marcus nodded, looking relieved. Marcus said, "I'm asking because I want you to know that I'd never do anything to make you regret letting me into your life. You've been through so much. You deserve someone who treats you with respect and love, and I promise I'll always try to be that person." I reached across the table and took his hand. I said, "I know, I trust you." And that's huge for me. It was true. Trust didn't come easily anymore. But Marcus had proven himself over and over, through his actions, his patience, his consistency. He was nothing like Daniel, and I was nothing like the woman I'd been when I was married to Daniel. I'd grown, evolved, learned to stand up for myself and recognize my own worth. That summer, I decided to do something I'd always wanted to do, but had never had the courage to attempt. I applied for a position as a lead teacher, overseeing the third-grade curriculum for our entire district. It was a significant step up, more responsibility, more visibility. The old Rebecca, the one who'd let Daniel convince her she wasn't capable or important, would never have applied. But the new Rebecca, the one who'd fought for herself and won, knew she was qualified and deserving. I got the position. When I told Marcus, he picked me up and spun me around, both of us laughing. Marcus said, "I knew you would. You're brilliant, and now everyone else will see it too." My first day in the new role was nerve-wracking. I was leading a meeting with teachers from 6 different schools, presenting a new curriculum framework I'd helped develop. As I stood at the front of the room looking at all those faces, I felt a moment of doubt. What if I wasn't good enough? What if they didn't take me seriously? But then I thought about everything I'd overcome. I'd survived an abusive marriage. I'd stood up to a man who'd tried to control and diminish me. I'd rebuilt my entire life from scratch. If I could do all that, I could certainly lead a curriculum meeting. The presentation went well. Teachers asked thoughtful questions, engaged with the material, and several came up afterward to thank me for the new framework. Driving home that day, I felt proud. Not just of the presentation, but of myself, of who I'd become. That evening, Marcus took me out to celebrate. We went to a nice restaurant downtown, the kind of place Daniel would have chosen, but then complained about the prices all night. With Marcus, there was no complaining, no tension. Just good food, good conversation, and the comfortable presence of someone who genuinely cared about me. Marcus said, "I have something for you." He pulled out a small box. My heart started racing. Was this what I thought it was? We'd only been dating a year and a half. Was I ready for this? I opened the box. Inside was a beautiful silver necklace with a small compass pendant. Marcus said, "It's a compass. Because you've navigated so much, found your way through really difficult terrain, and you did it by trusting yourself. I wanted you to have something to remind you of that strength." I started crying. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. This man understood me. valued me, saw me for who I really was. I said, "It's perfect. Thank you." He fastened it around my neck, and I touched the compass pendant, feeling its weight, its symbolism. I had found my way. Through the darkness of my marriage, through the pain of divorce, through the uncertainty of starting over, I'd found my way back to myself. As the months passed, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I excelled in my new position, implementing programs that helped students across the district. My relationship with Marcus continued to deepen, built on mutual respect, trust, and genuine affection. I'd repaired relationships with family members I'd distanced myself from during my marriage. I had a full, rich life. One afternoon, about 2 years after my divorce, I was grocery shopping when I saw Daniel. He was in the produce section, looking older, tired. For a moment, I considered walking the other way, avoiding the encounter entirely. But then I realized I didn't need to avoid him. He had no power over me anymore. I walked past him, not making eye contact, focused on my shopping. As I reached for some apples, I heard his voice. Daniel said, "Rebecca." I turned. He looked uncomfortable, awkward. Daniel said, "How are you?" I said, "I'm well. Very well, actually." He nodded, seeming to struggle for words. Daniel said, "I heard you got a promotion. Lead teacher for the district. That's impressive." I said, "Thank you." There was a long pause. He seemed like he wanted to say something else, maybe apologize, maybe explain. But I didn't need or want his apologies or explanations. That chapter was closed. I said, "Take care, Daniel." I walked away, pushing my cart toward the checkout. My hands were steady, my heart was calm. Seeing him didn't upset me or trigger old wounds. He was simply someone I used to know, someone from a life I'd outgrown. That night, I told Marcus about the encounter. Marcus said, "How did you feel seeing him?" I said, "Honestly, nothing. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. He's just a person now, not someone who has any emotional impact on me." Marcus said, "That's powerful. It means you've really healed." I said, "I have. I really have." And it was true. The woman who'd been slapped at dinner, who'd cried herself to sleep wondering what she'd done wrong, who'd been afraid to stand up for herself, that woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, more confident, someone who knew her worth and wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. A few months later, Marcus asked me to move in with him. It was a big step, and I took time to think about it seriously. Living with someone again, sharing space, merging lives, it brought up old fears. But as I thought about Marcus, about who he was and how he treated me, I realized those fears were based on my experience with Daniel, not on the reality of who Marcus was. I said yes. We found a beautiful apartment together, spent weekends furniture shopping and decorating, making it ours. It felt different from living with Daniel. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells, no worrying about saying the wrong thing or making a mistake. There was just partnership, collaboration, mutual respect. One Sunday morning, about 6 months after we'd moved in together, I woke up to the smell of coffee and pancakes. I went into the kitchen and found Marcus cooking breakfast, humming along to music playing on his phone. He turned and smiled when he saw me. Marcus said, "Good morning, beautiful. I made your favorite." I walked over and hugged him from behind, resting my head against his back. I said, "Thank you, for this, for everything." Marcus said, "You don't have to thank me for making you breakfast." I said, "I'm not just thanking you for breakfast. I'm thanking you for being patient with me, for understanding my past and not holding it against me, for showing me what a healthy relationship looks like." He turned around and cupped my face in his hands. Marcus said, "Rebecca, loving you is easy. You make it easy, and I'm grateful every day that you let me into your life." We ate breakfast together, talking about our plans for the day, laughing about something funny one of my students had said, making plans for a trip we wanted to take. It was ordinary and mundane and absolutely perfect. Later that afternoon, I was going through some old boxes I'd kept in storage, deciding what to keep and what to throw away. I found my wedding album from my marriage to Daniel. I sat on the floor and flipped through it, looking at photos of a younger version of myself, smiling in a white dress, holding hands with a man I thought I knew. I felt sadness looking at those photos, but not for the marriage itself. I felt sad for that young woman who didn't know what she was getting into, who believed that love meant compromise even when that compromise meant losing herself, who thought she could fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. But I also felt grateful. Grateful that I'd eventually found the strength to leave. Grateful for the lessons I'd learned. Grateful that I'd become someone who wouldn't tolerate abuse, who valued herself, who knew the difference between love and control. I closed the album and put it in a box labeled Donate. That chapter was over. It was time to let it go completely. Marcus came into the room and saw what I was doing. Marcus said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I really am. I was just thinking about how far I've come, how different my life is now." Marcus said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't left him? If you'd stayed?" I said, "Sometimes. I think I would have kept shrinking, kept losing pieces of myself until there was nothing left. Maybe I would have become so depressed I couldn't function. Maybe the abuse would have escalated. I don't know. But I do know it wouldn't have gotten better." Marcus said, "I'm glad you left. Selfishly, because it means I got to meet you. But mostly because you deserve so much better than what he gave you." I said, "I know that now. It took me a long time to believe it, but I know it now." That evening, we had Jennifer and Maria over for dinner. As we cooked together, laughed together, shared stories and wine, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. These people, this life, this version of myself, it was all a result of one difficult decision I'd made 2.5 years ago. The decision to pack Daniel's bags, the decision to stand up for myself, the decision to refuse to accept abuse. Maria raised her glass. Maria said, "To Rebecca, who taught us all what real courage looks like." Jennifer said, "And to finding the strength to walk away from what's killing you and toward what makes you whole." Marcus said, "To second chances and new beginnings." I said, "To all of us. Thank you for being my family, for supporting me, for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself." We clinked glasses, and I looked around at these faces, these people who loved me unconditionally, who celebrated my victories and supported me through my struggles. This was what love was supposed to look like. Not control or criticism or violence, but support, respect, genuine care. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Marcus and I were cleaning up the kitchen. He was washing dishes while I dried them, and we worked in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that comes from being completely at ease with someone. Marcus said, "Can I ask you something I've been wondering about?" I said, "Sure." Marcus said, "That night, when you packed his bags, were you scared?" I thought about it. Remembering that afternoon, the way my hands had shaken as I'd pulled his clothes from the closet, the way my heart had pounded when I'd heard his car in the driveway. I said, terrified. I was absolutely terrified. I didn't know what he'd do, how he'd react. Part of me worried he'd get violent again, or that I wouldn't be able to stand my ground, or that I'd lose my nerve and back down. Marcus said, "But you didn't." I said, "No, I didn't." Because as scared as I was of confronting him, I was more scared of what would happen if I didn't. I was scared of spending the rest of my life being small and sad and controlled. That fear was bigger than my fear of him. Marcus said, "That's real bravery. Doing something terrifying because the alternative is worse." I said, "I guess." At the time, it didn't feel brave. It felt desperate. It felt like survival. Marcus said, "Sometimes those are the same thing." He was right. Looking back now, I could see that everything I'd done, from filing the police report to hiring a lawyer, to standing up to Daniel when he came home, it had all been an act of survival. I'd been fighting for my life, for my sanity, for my future, and I'd won. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a run. It was a crisp fall morning, leaves crunching under my feet, the air sharp and clean. As I ran, I thought about my journey, about the woman I'd been and the woman I'd become. I thought about my students, who looked up to me and trusted me to guide them. I thought about Marcus, who loved me without trying to change me. I thought about my family and friends who'd stood by me, and I thought about Daniel, wherever he was, whatever he was doing. I hoped he'd gotten help, learned from his mistakes, become a better person. But honestly, his journey wasn't my concern anymore. Mine was. When I got home, Marcus was making coffee. He handed me a cup and kissed my forehead. Marcus said, "Good run?" I said, "Great run." I was thinking about everything, about how lucky I am. Marcus said, "We're both lucky." And he was right. We were lucky, not because life was perfect or easy, but because we'd both learned hard lessons and come through them stronger. Because we valued each other and ourselves. Because we knew what we didn't want and had the courage to walk away from it. Later that day, I was at school, working with a group of teachers on implementing a new reading program. One of the teachers, a young woman named Ashley who was in her first year of teaching, stayed after to talk to me. Ashley said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I said, "Of course." Ashley said, "I've been in a relationship for 3 years, and lately, things have been really hard. My boyfriend criticizes me constantly, tells me I'm too sensitive, makes me feel like everything is my fault. But I keep thinking maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm the problem." My heart sank. I knew exactly what she was describing because I'd lived it. I said, "Ashley, can I share something with you? A few years ago, I was in a marriage that sounds a lot like your relationship. My husband criticized me constantly, made me feel small, blamed me for everything. It took me a long time to realize that wasn't love. That was control and emotional abuse." Ashley's eyes filled with tears. Ashley said, "But he's not always like that. Sometimes he's really sweet and loving." I said, "I know. Mine was too. But the cycle of being cruel and then being sweet, that's part of the pattern. It keeps you off balance, keeps you hoping things will get better, keeps you blaming yourself." Ashley said, "What did you do?" I said, "I left. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the best decision I've ever made. I'm not saying that's what you need to do. Only you can make that choice. But I'm saying you deserve to be with someone who treats you with respect and kindness all the time, not just when they feel like it." We talked for another hour. I shared my story, not in great detail, but enough to let her know she wasn't alone, that I understood what she was going through, that there was a way out if she chose to take it. When she left, she hugged me tightly. Ashley said, "Thank you for being honest with me, for sharing your story. It helps to know someone else has been through this and come out okay." I said, "More than okay. I came out better, stronger. And you will too, whatever you decide." Driving home that day, I felt a sense of purpose. My experience, as painful as it had been, gave me the ability to help others, to recognize the signs of abuse, to offer support, to be proof that you can leave and rebuild and thrive. That evening, I told Marcus about my conversation with Ashley. Marcus said, "That must have been hard, revisiting all that." I said, "It was, but it was also important. If my story can help someone else, then something good came from all that pain." Marcus said, "You're amazing, you know that?" I said, "I'm just someone who learned some hard lessons and wants to help others avoid the same mistakes." Marcus said, "No, you're someone who survived something terrible and chose to use that experience to help others. That's amazing." A few weeks later, Ashley sent me a text. She'd broken up with her boyfriend and moved in with a friend. She said it was scary but also liberating, that she was already feeling lighter, more like herself. I felt proud of her, happy that she'd found the courage to choose herself. As the year came to a close, I reflected on everything that had changed. 3 years ago, I'd been trapped in an abusive marriage, feeling hopeless and worthless. Now I had a career I loved, a partner who respected me, friends and family who supported me, and most importantly, I had myself back. On New Year's Eve, Marcus and I stayed home, cooking dinner together and watching the ball drop on television. As midnight approached, he pulled me close. Marcus said, "What are you hoping for this new year?" I said, "Honestly, more of this. More peace, more growth, more moments like this where I feel completely content." Marcus said, "I can do more of this. And I want to do it for a long time." He pulled out a small box. My heart started racing again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from excitement, from hope, from the knowledge that this man loved me and I loved him, and we'd built something real and healthy together. Marcus said, "Rebecca, you're the strongest, most incredible person I've ever met. You've shown me what real courage looks like, what it means to fight for yourself and build the life you deserve. I want to spend the rest of my life supporting you, loving you, and growing with you." Will you marry me? I looked at the ring, beautiful and simple, then at Marcus, his eyes full of love and hope. 3 years ago, the idea of getting married again would have terrified me. But now, knowing what I knew, being who I'd become, it didn't feel scary at all. I said, yes. Absolutely yes. He slipped the ring on my finger, and we kissed as fireworks exploded on the television behind us, celebrating the new year, new beginnings, new possibilities. As we held each other, I thought about that night 3 years ago when Daniel had slapped me. I thought about the decision I'd made the next morning to pack his bags, to stand up for myself, to refuse to accept abuse. That decision had led me here, to this moment, to this life, to this love. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the most important ones. Sometimes you have to walk through fire to get to the other side. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself. I'd done all of that, and I'd come through it stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. The past didn't define me anymore. My scars were proof of survival, not weakness. And my future was mine to create, no longer limited by someone else's cruelty or control. As the clock struck midnight, I looked at Marcus and then at the ring on my finger. This was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not just freedom from Daniel, but freedom to be myself, to love and be loved in a healthy way, to live a life that made me happy and whole. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been pain and fear and doubt. But standing there on New Year's Eve, engaged to a man who treated me with respect and kindness, surrounded by love and possibility, I knew it had all been worth it. Every hard decision, every moment of courage, every step forward had led me here. And I was finally, truly home.